everyone, so I know I have individual videos on each of the 3 friezes on the OCR Greek Art syllabus, but I thought it might be useful to do one that took a synoptic look at the friezes for you. For many reasons. One, it's important to be able to draw links between the different friezes to see developments over time. It also allows for evaluative comments as well about the differences and perhaps the superiority of a particular frieze in one aspect, which will of course help you hit those higher marks for analysis and evaluation. So I'm going to start by looking at the location of the different friezes. If we think first of all about the Siphonian Treasury, which is the one on the top right here, we've got that traditional frieze on the outside of the building. It runs all the way around the 4 sides and it's very accessible and visible to anybody who's passing along the sacred way at Delphi. In contrast, however, we have to remember that the Parthenon frieze in the 2 images on the top line here is inside the main columns and it's on the outer cellar walls, which means that you've got to actually peek up and inside the columns to get a glimpse of it. The image on the left has been taken by a drone, otherwise we would not be able to see it from that angle. And if you look at it through the columns, you are getting an interrupted view of the procession. So that's going to mean that you're just going to get slight kind of screenshots rather of what's happening, as opposed to, say, today if you're in the British Museum standing with it in front of you and able to see the whole thing. So you need to just bear that in mind in terms of the ancient experience. At the bottom, we've got a temple plan for the Temple of Apollo at Bassae. And here this shows that the frieze is now actually inside the cellar itself. And of course, there's going to be a couple of things to think about there. It's perhaps less accessible, but those who do go inside the temple will have a more intimate experience. They'll be able to see it up closer than they would do on the Parthenon, for example. We also have to consider that there would be restrictions of light. So there are 2 entrances to the cellar. You can see one on the traditional entrance and then there is one on the side as well. So there would be glimpses of light coming in, but you would get kind of flashes of what's happening on that scene as we get those moments of light versus moments of shadow. So it would be, as Robin Elsborne puts it, quite a dramatic play of shadows and light. So quite a difference really between the locations and the viewing experience of each of our friezes. When it comes to the subject matter, again, we've got a bit of variety there. The majority of the friezes have mythological stories. So on the Siphonian Treasury at Delphi, you'll be able to see on the top register here, the East frieze shows a scene from the Trojan War. We've got Achilles fighting Memnon and the gods in council discussing the outcome of this battle. We've also, on the second register, got a gigantomachy. So lots of mythological stories. The purpose of these really are to show the superiority of the gods, because in every scene on the Siphonian Treasury we can see ultimately that the gods can punish those for bad behaviour or hubris in the case of the giants, who are interestingly dressed as Greek hoplites to make that warning even more relatable, or, as I say with the Trojan War, to form a council to be able to discuss the outcome there. Similarly at Bassae, we have mythological stories of Centauromachy and Amazonamachy. So the 2 of those friezes both looking as well at the relationship between the Greeks and others in the subject matter. The Parthenon frieze is the exception. We've got more of an everyday occurrence there with the Panathenaic procession showcasing the celebration for Athena's birthday. However, even then, it's still not entirely realistic because it's more of an idealised view. There are elements to that procession that are emphasised. For example, the cavalrymen, who are, according to John Boardman, meant to represent the heroes from the Battle of Marathon, the 192 fallen dead. We've also got the gods in attendance there as well. So an idealised image, but nonetheless one that is more everyday and reflective of that everyday life than the other 2 friezes. When it comes to characterization and individuals and being able to pick out specific people from the frieze and identify them, again, we've got a little bit of variety there. So it varies on the Siphnian treasury. We have to remember that this is archaic in its date. So there is going to be a little bit more generalized individuals than we might see in the later classical periods. But for example, if we just go to the gigantomachy at the bottom, then we do have some recognizable characters here. The gods are a little bit more identifiable via their attributes. For example, there is further on in this scene a mirrored version of Apollo and Artemis, and it's quite clear from Apollo's long loose hair and no beard who he is. But there is still perhaps not as clear an attribution as we see on the Parthenon, because we are struggling really on the gigantomachy to decide whether we're looking at perhaps Themis or Cybele in that chariot. There's dispute amongst classicists. Similarly, if we just have a look at the scene where you've got the gods in council in the top middle, there's hardly any distinguishing between Eos and Artemis there. They are identical in pose, they are identical in drapery and hairstyle. So this is more about creating pattern than it is creating individuals. The Parthenon does this much more. We can see here Hermes and Dionysus on the top right. Hermes identifiable by the traveller's hat on his knee, and Dionysus with the raised arm, which no doubt held a wine cup. And if you were to go along that frieze, you would see Demeter with a torch, and you would see Ares resting his foot on a shield as well. So the attributes are much clearer on the Parthenon. With the Bassae frieze, on the whole, because it is a Centauromachy and an Amazonamachy, we've got less figures individually that we can identify. It's more about the chaos of the whole scene. But we can pick out Heracles, who is fighting the queen of the Amazons, Hippolyta, because he has got his lion skin behind him there. The portrayal of anatomy also differs between the three friezes, and not surprisingly, because we are looking at three friezes of three different artistic dates. The Siphnian treasury is archaic, and you can really see that archaic anatomy reminiscent of when we studied the freestanding statues coming through. And we've got the long braided Egyptian style hair, for example. And much of the figure is actually covered up as well, so we're not able to see much of the body on show. Where we do see anatomy, for example, on the Parthenon, this now is much more realistic. It's softer, it's more sculpted, and it feels very typical of that high classical period with the definition in the muscles, and also that distinguishing of the different ages, for example, with beards, altogether a lot more developed. With the Bassae frieze, whereas I would say the figures on the Parthenon are quite idealised in their anatomy, especially those of the cavalrymen who look very much like the Doryphoros, the spear bearer by Polyclitus. On the Bassae frieze, if you have a look at that top right, these are now much more bulky figures, so more realistic, less idealistic like those on the Parthenon. This is perhaps to make it more relatable, because this is a frieze which is coming in the decades after the Peloponnesian War. So there is a renewed interest in showing scenes of warfare and of the effect as well on those involved. So perhaps this is to draw in the viewer and to help them relate with the Lapiths in this case, who symbolise our civilised Greeks. The use of drapery is also something else that you can have a look at in terms of how it differs between the three friezes. If we have a look at the Siphnian treasury at the bottom, I've previously mentioned there is a focus on pattern here on this particular frieze, and you can see that in the drapery with the very ordered pattern to the clothing, the catenary folds, the U-shaped folds on our cloaks, and we've also got some lines and modelling lines on the legs themselves. With the Parthenon, there is still a desire to create pattern with our drapery. You can see the catenary folds, which are hanging off the drapery from Apollo's arm, and the very, very effective modelling lines on the legs. We can also see Artemis' breasts through her clothing, so the drapery is also showing the body underneath, but it just feels altogether more natural now and less rigid. The drapery seems to move with the body. When it comes to the Bassi frieze, the drapery on this frieze is described by Osborne, in fact criticised by Osborne, as being rather too fantastical because it seems to swirl in the background of the scene. However, I do feel that that can also add to that feeling of chaos and conflict. So we can see it there on the top right doing that, floating up in the background behind our Lapith woman who is trying to escape. It's also there revealing her body. And in fact, that's one of the other uses really of drapery on this frieze, is that kind of shock factor, that the drapery is being removed from these women in order to expose them, and we see their vulnerability at the hands of the barbarous centaurs. In fact, if we just look at that woman who is being exposed fully in that top middle image, she's actually clasping onto a statue of Athena, which makes this even more horrifying because she should be really under the protection of the goddess at that moment in time. We can also look at the poses, and for this one, because it's a little bit more involved, I've just separated out the three different friezes. When it comes to the poses on the Siphonian treasury, again like the drapery with the gods, the poses can create pattern because we see the mirroring there of Eos and Artemis, and on that top right image we see the mirroring poses of Apollo and Artemis striding forwards. There's a lot of overlapping to show that chaos, but there is also the use of poses to show vulnerability. If we look at those who are fallen, for example, and lying horizontal on the ground and looking out towards us, the viewer, as well for sympathy. Because it's the archaic period, some poses are a little bit impossible and the body does not respond accurately to them. For example, the giant who Apollo and Artemis are chasing is running forwards, but somehow he is also, his top half, able to look fully back at the gods behind him. With the Parthenon, because there are so many different parts to it, the poses of course are going to differ depending on which section we're having a look at. With the gods in council, and we can see Hermes and Dionysus there, not in council, with the gods there celebrating Athena's birthday, we can see that they are rather relaxed in their poses. They turn around to talk to one another. Some of them recline as well, such as Ares. So this really symbolises the kind of celebratory nature, and they're much less rigid than the poses on the Siphonian treasury. Occasionally we get very kind of solemn, upright poses to reflect that this is a procession in its nature, such as the women who are carrying the sacrificial objects in the bottom left. But some of the poses that I find most interesting are to do with the cavalrymen, because there's such a combination amongst them. It really gives a feel of that procession slowly starting with a walk, getting the horses ready. You can see that middle image there is slow and steady. They turn round perhaps to talk to one another, but they're very much at the beginning of this. Whereas those cavalrymen up ahead have already started to canter, and you can see them there with the horses rearing up to show that movement. So I think that's really effective because the viewer walking alongside and looking up is going to get glimpses of that procession starting to move as they're moving themselves. Finally, with the Bassi frieze, lots of overlapping to show conflict and to show depth. We can see Heracles and Hippolyta crossing over one another in these dynamic diagonals, which are always reminiscent of conflict in a scene. We have very violent poses as well. We have women trying to push off the centaurs, or we have, for example, that top right, a centaur biting a Lapith who plunges his sword into the centaur's body simultaneously. or we have poses that show the vulnerability of women, such as in the scene I showed you before, where they're being exposed and now their outstretched arms appeal to us as the viewer for help, making us much more involved in the Basai frieze than any other of the friezes that we have looked at. And finally, I should just note in the bottom left, and I'm going to talk about the reason for this in a moment, that we've got very similar poses between the fallen Greeks and the fallen Amazons. And normally, if you were to watch my video on the other, you would see that the Greeks are often shown as different to those that they are fighting against, whether it's Amazons or Trojans, for example, whether it's in appearance or pose or superiority. So this is rather unusual to see them both slumped in a way that encourages us to feel sympathy and also not to really know who we should be siding with in that particular moment. Emotion as well can be compared and contrasted between the three scenes. There is emotion in every frieze. So for the Siphnian treasury, we've got the emotion created by the mothers who are appealing for the lives of their sons. And this is done more through body language than it is through the facial features itself. With the Parthenon, because it is a celebratory event, the emotion is very different. Again, body language, turning to talk to one another. They look animated, they look excited. We also get that emotion, perhaps that celebratory, patriotic feel from the cavalrymen looking to one another as they are taking part in the procession. Where the emotion, though, just feels so much more involved, and I feel like I am saying this time and time again, but it's just such a powerful piece, is in the treatment of the figures on the Basai frieze, especially the women. And that's probably the most relatable element of emotion across all three of the friezes. And that brings me to my final point, which is why? Why do we have such strong emotion on the Basai frieze, and why do we have less of a distinguishing focus between our Greeks and the other, in this case the Amazons? And that's to do with what's happening in Greece at the time, or has happened in the decades previously. It's always worth looking back at the history. And that's the Peloponnesian Wars. And this is a civil war between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies. So we've got Greeks fighting Greeks, and it makes it much more difficult for the Greeks to identify who is the enemy. It was a little bit more clear-cut when it was the Persians. And of course, as well, after decades of war, they will have felt the effects on those involved, particularly the civilians like the women. And that's why we get this more somber tone. It's a less celebratory version of the Greeks fighting somebody else.